Housing. Everybody needs it. And whether you're rich, poor, or somewhere in between, the odds are you've noticed prices going up and options going down in your housing market in the last 5 years. According to Zillow, home prices in the U.S. have risen roughly 48% since before the pandemic. The median price of a house is now more than 7 times higher than the median salary, a bigger discrepancy than in the 2008 housing bubble. And Illinois has not escaped these trends. Right now, 32% of people in Illinois are housing burdened, meaning they're spending at least 30% of their income on basic housing. And nearly 1 in 6 Illinoisans are putting half their income toward housing. That's more than any other state in the Midwest, and it's a sign that Illinois is becoming unaffordable. There are several reasons for this, but many of them come back to one surprising fact. We simply aren't building enough. In this video, I'll talk about how supply affects affordability in the housing market and why Illinois has a problem with that. I want to make one thing clear. These policies affect all levels of the housing market. If you believe this discussion is only for people looking for a brand new house in a fancy subdivision, think again. The rental market, and especially the rental market for low-income households, depends on the availability of new development, whether in Chicago or downstate. And to be clear, all the construction stats we're talking about here refer to units, whether that unit is a studio apartment or a 4-bedroom single-family home. With that in mind, let's start by taking a look at the problem itself. Everybody knows the first core driver of housing prices is the same as any other market: supply and demand. But after several years of net out-migration, demand is probably not the main cause of Illinois' tight prices. The issue lies with supply. Take a look at the number of units built per 100,000 people over the past 5 years. The average for states is about 450. Illinois is the second worst in the nation by this metric, at just 150. Chicago is better than downstate, but that's still the worst of the top 10 major metro areas in the country. In other words, Illinois is only building about a third of the housing that you would expect for a state of its size. What kind of impact does this supply stagnation have? We can find out by comparing Chicago to another Midwestern city that is building. Minneapolis is making a concerted effort to increase its number of housing units. As a result, their housing supply increased by about 12% in 5 years, while Chicago's only grew 4%. The result? Chicago prices have skyrocketed, while Minneapolis rates have remained basically unchanged, meaning they're much more affordable today. It's a great illustration of supply and demand at work. And it's also not an isolated example. New York University's Furman Center recently conducted a study that confirmed a cause and effect relationship between greater housing supply and lower rent prices. So why is Illinois doing so poorly at making new housing? Put another way, what's stopping us from building more right now? Our research has revealed 3 main obstacles, and I'm going to break them down one by one: regulations, zoning, and property taxes. First, regulations. Nationwide, government regulations and fees contribute nearly a quarter to the final sales price of every new home. In Illinois, that would be about $110,000 in regulation costs alone for the average new home. Where does that money go? Well, let's take a look at what's required to build in Chicago. Most projects require a building permit, of course, which in the city means a minimum fee of about $3,500 for residential housing. The process requires an application, a plan review, as many revisions as are necessary, up to a final review where the permit fee will be calculated. On top of that, there are separate permits for sewer service, water service, sign installation, elevator installation, demolition, and more, each of them adding time and money. And permits aren't the only kind of regulation that add expense and difficulty to the housing market. For example, Governor Pritzker signed a bill requiring new construction to include an electric vehicle charging port, whether or not the owner wants an electric vehicle. And in Chicago, the Affordable Requirements Ordinance makes it harder for developers to secure financing for a project, even if all their permits are fine. Number 2, zoning. In a way, zoning is just another subset of regulations, but these rules do so much to stifle development that they warrant a discussion of their own. Put simply, zoning laws are a description of what can be built where. They generally require commercial buildings to be built in commercial zones and residential buildings to be built in residential zones. It sounds reasonable, but in practice, these laws can prevent communities from being adaptive as their needs change. A great example of this is the Loop in downtown Chicago. Since the pandemic, the vacancy rate for downtown office buildings has risen to more than 25%. A great solution to this would be to convert some of those buildings from office space, which isn't needed, to residential residential, which is still in high demand. But zoning regulations have kept such conversions from happening, except in a few cases that just recently got special permission from the mayor. A downstate example of this can be found in Bloomington. In an interview with Illinois State University, the founder of a community revitalization group says zoning is to blame for boarded up apartments in the city's downtown. And those could be very helpful if they were available for rent, especially since the university is welcoming its largest freshman class and doesn't have enough student housing. The good news is that most local municipalities have a lot of say over zoning rules, which means they may be able to make necessary changes fairly easily. However, for the 36% of Illinoisans who live in areas without home rule, there are even more state laws that restrict their ability to act. Whenever a non-home rule town wants to change their zoning, under state law, the mayor must create a zoning commission, which in turn follows a lengthy process before any changes are enacted. Overall, Illinois is the 30th in the U.S. for land use freedom, meaning most other states are more adaptable when their needs change. Finally, the third major factor that makes building so difficult: property taxes. We have the second highest rates in the nation, higher than any of our neighbors in the Midwest, and it's a major burden on owners and renters alike when it comes to calculating house payments. Illinois' median property tax bill is more than triple Indiana's. It's 40% higher than Wisconsin, which is the closest price of any neighboring state. For potential homebuyers, a couple hundred extra bucks a month can easily make the difference between whether a mortgage is affordable or not. And if you're not an owner, the taxes get passed along to you in your monthly rent. In fact, property taxes are so important to livability that they're cited as one of the main reasons people move out of Illinois. But true property tax relief would need to come down to pension reform, a monster topic if you're here in Illinois. But if you're interested in understanding more about it, we did this video a few years ago. So the best things Illinois could do to improve the housing market would be to cut excessive time-consuming regulations, free up usable space with zoning reform, and lower the property tax burden. But even if we were to do all these things tomorrow, there's still one hurdle we haven't discussed: time. Building those properties takes time, and until those properties are finished and livable, we won't see the effects of improved supply. Look at this chart showing how many housing units different cities are expected to add over the next 5 years. Chicago is expected to underperform cities like Raleigh and Salt Lake City, which means that even if these policies were enacted today, it would still be quite a while before the housing supply moves in a way that can be felt by most families. This may sound discouraging, but the truth is it should be motivating. It means that if we want relief for ourselves, our neighbors, and those less fortunate, we need to enact these policy changes quickly. Relief is possible. Other cities have proven it. And with the right changes in place, Chicago and the entirety of Illinois can prove it too.